June 23, 1942. At a quiet airfield in South Wales, Royal Air Force spotters peered through binoculars at a shape descending through the clouds. It was sleek, fast, unmistakably German. A Focke-Wulf 190, the Luftwaffe's most feared fighter. Normally, alarms would have been blaring and anti-aircraft guns swinging into position. But something about the way the aircraft approached didn't seem threatening. Its descent was calm, controlled. The German fighter touched down gently on the grass runway and rolled to a smooth stop near the control tower. The engine shut down. The canopy slid open. A young pilot climbed out, Oberleutnant Armin Faber of Jagdgeschwader 2. He looked around at the strange buildings, confused for a moment. Then he froze. The aircraft parked nearby weren't Messerschmitts. They were Spitfires. The men running toward him weren't German ground crew. They were wearing RAF blue. In that instant, Faber realized the terrible truth. He hadn't landed in France. He was in Britain. And at that same moment, British intelligence officers across southern England were realizing what this meant. Germany's most advanced fighter, the aircraft that had dominated the skies for months, had just fallen right into their hands, completely intact. For almost a year, the Focke-Wulf 190 had haunted Allied pilots. It first appeared over France in 1941, and from the start, it outclassed every Allied fighter in service. Squadron leader Johnny Johnson, who would later become Britain's top-scoring ace, wrote that the 190 was faster in level flight and dive, could outroll the Spitfire, and packed far heavier firepower. It was, he said, a nightmare to fight. In the first half of 1942, RAF losses soared. Veteran pilots were being shot down by opponents they simply couldn't match. American airmen arriving in Britain were warned right away, don't try to turn with an FW-190, don't follow it into a dive, and never, ever try to outroll it. But intelligence officers needed to know why it was so good and how to beat it. They needed to study a real one. Until that day in June, every FW-190 brought down over Britain had been too damaged to tell them anything useful. Armin Faber changed that with one wrong turn. Faber wasn't inexperienced. At just 21, he was already a decorated pilot in the elite Richthofen wing. On that day, he was leading a mission across the Channel to protect German bombers striking coastal targets. The fight went as planned, until the flight home. In the confusion of battle, with cloud cover thick and the sun reflecting off the water, Faber became disoriented. He lost track of direction, turned 180 degrees without realizing it, and when he finally broke through the clouds and saw green fields below, he thought he was over northern France. He wasn't. He was in Wales. Believing he was approaching a friendly base, he lined up for landing at RAF Pembrey. The mistake was simple, but catastrophic. When he stepped out of the cockpit and saw the Spitfires and British uniforms, it was too late. He tried to restart the engine, but ground crews had already surrounded him. Within minutes, he was in custody, and the RAF had the prize they had been dreaming of, a completely intact FW-190. At RAF headquarters, the reaction was immediate. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas ordered the aircraft sent to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for testing. Within 48 hours, engineers and test pilots were studying every inch of it. What they found was astonishing. The FW-190 wasn't just powerful, it was brilliantly practical. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced 1,700 horsepower, more than any Spitfire of the time. But its real advantage was agility. The roll rate was phenomenal. The pilot could flip the aircraft from one side to the other faster than any Allied fighter, changing direction instantly in combat. Test pilot Eric Brown later said you could throw it around the sky with almost no effort. The Spitfire needed finesse. The 190 responded to thought. Its armament was devastating. 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns firing in a tight pattern. A 2-second burst could destroy a Spitfire, and its clean design meant it could dive faster than anything the Allies flew. But the tests also revealed weaknesses. Above 20,000 feet, its engine struggled. Cooling problems reduced power at high altitude. Its heavy structure made it less agile in long turning fights. And at very high speeds, the controls became so heavy that pulling out of a dive was physically difficult. Those discoveries were gold for Allied tacticians. By August 1942, American pilots were arriving at Farnborough to study the captured fighter. Major Cass Howe, one of the first to fly it, wrote in his report, "The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet. But above 25,000, we have the advantage. Force them high, and we win." That insight changed Allied air tactics almost overnight. The U.S. Army Air Force began training Thunderbolt and Mustang pilots to fight at altitude. Bomber escorts now flew high, forcing German fighters to climb into thin air where their engines weakened. Engineers also learned from the 190. They improved Allied roll rates, refined gun placement, and adopted better cockpit layouts. Just as important, the fear surrounding the German fighter began to fade. It wasn't invincible anymore. It had limits, and now everyone knew them. By late 1943, the tide had turned. New Spitfire Mark 9s and American P-47s and P-51s were meeting the FW-190 on equal terms. The Allies now controlled when and how battles were fought. German ace Joseph Priller wrote in his logbook that American pilots had clearly studied the aircraft. They no longer follow us into rolling scissors. They force us high, where our engines labor. Back at Farnborough, Faber's captured plane was still being used to test every new German variant that appeared. When the improved Dora model arrived in 1944, British engineers compared it directly to Faber's aircraft to understand what the Germans had changed. Historians later agreed that Faber's mistake had given the Allies one of the greatest intelligence windfalls of the war. The data from that single aircraft shaped tactics, training, and aircraft design across the Allied air forces. Chest pilot Eric Brown later summed it up perfectly. Faber's error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design. Every strength and every weakness was revealed. Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in a Canadian prisoner camp. He survived and returned to Germany after the war, living quietly until 1976. At first, he was blamed for losing the Luftwaffe's prized fighter, but later even his superiors admitted that combat disorientation could happen to anyone. For the Allies, his mistake became a symbol, proof that even the most advanced technology could be undone by a single human error. The Focke-Wulf 190 had been the terror of the skies, a masterpiece of German engineering. But once its secrets were known, its advantage disappeared. Its power at low altitude came at the cost of high-altitude performance. Its unmatched roll rate came with heavy controls at speed, and its heavy armament reduced maneuverability. Once Allied pilots understood those trade-offs, they exploited them and won. Today, surviving FW-190s sit in museums, admired as engineering marvels. But their legend is forever tied to that day in 1942, when a single pilot landed the enemy's greatest weapon on British soil. It was a moment that changed the balance of power in the skies, not through combat, but through a mistake. because in war, technology matters, but intelligence matters more. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from firepower or strategy, but from a single, simple error that gives your enemy exactly what they needed to win.